Hello and welcome back to Health Unlock, the power of salutogenesis with Jason. Jason, how are you?
Not too bad. I've got a little bit more time these days because my son got his driver's license, so he's now driving himself to college.
That's congrats. That's good news. That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know today we are doing the next episode, which is all about why good intentions aren't enough, right? And again, to our listeners, to our viewers, if you want to catch up, we are following kind of a sequence. You can always go back and listen to the older episodes on the show's website or Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcast from. So now jumping in directly to the first question, Jason. So in in our earlier conversation, you said that something that stuck with me, that it does not matter whether a founder has good intention. What what did you mean by that? It sounds depressive.
I don't mean to be real cynical here, but I say it because we've got 100 years of evidence. So insulin is a really good example, right? If you look at it was Banting and Best discovered it in 1921, and they sold their patent to the University of Toronto for $1. Now, I guess that's what is that? That's still less than $20 today. So not a lot. And their intention was pretty clear, right? That it should be insulin should be available to every diabetic on the planet. And, fast forward 100 years, and it took federal legislation and public outcry over rationing deaths to get insulin copays capped at a reasonable price. And, so that's whatever, 100 years of structural extraction before external forces kind of intervened. So nobody along the way kind of woke up and said, hey, let's just, betray Banting and Best's trust and extract as much money as we can out of people. It was more the structure that encouraged all of this. And, from incremental patent extensions on delivery methods and regulatory barriers that prevent, I guess, biosimilars from entering the market, and pricing opacity, all of this stuff at every layer. And the intention kind of became irrelevant because the structure didn't enforce it. And, this is across domains. Google kind of had the same pattern, right? Different domain. Their don't be evil. And, they meant it, or I believe they meant it. But once advertising revenue became kind of the dominant business model, it didn't really matter anymore. And the incentive to maximize engagement overrode kind of every ethical commitment they started with. Not because people changed, but because the economics changed. They even quietly removed that don't be evil from their charter or a code of conduct or whatever it was actually in. And even jump into government with the Affordable Care Act. I could be wrong, but I like to believe that Obama generally intended to expand access and lower costs for people, but it created these structural accommodations to the insurance industry that locked in the extraction dynamics that it was trying to address. And coverage might have expanded a little bit at the time, but the cost structure that makes the coverage necessary in the first place got all reinforced. And so that's three completely different domains: health, technology, and government, and three sets of people who might have meant well, but the same structure of large capital pressure that overrode those intentions. That pattern is consistent enough that we should stop being surprised by it. Structural capture is kind of the default outcome. And the question isn't whether people have good intentions, it's whether the structure that they built can survive contact with the larger capital economic pressure.
Yeah. And unfortunately for most of the tech businesses, right, on the name of business model, these practices are implemented, which are kind of not always in the favor of people, or more in the favor of how do you make a dollar out of it, especially in healthcare too. So one of the things, I mean, there are, those are all big institutions. So I couldn't someone just argue that the problem is the scale itself, and that a smaller organization with the right people could actually keep its promises, because you just can't be under the radar and not get bothered.
Perhaps, and that's possible. But kind of thing is everyone believes about, within their own organization, oh, we're different and we have the right team and we're mission driven. And, I get it because I'm saying the same thing. But the difference is that I guess I don't even trust myself to stay that way. Right. So here's a pattern, right? You start with a small team. Everybody does that, they all kind of share the same values. Everything's aligned. Nobody needs kind of this external governance because everyone agrees. But then you need capital. And that first round comes from people who share your vision, probably friends and family, and that's great. The second round comes from people who probably like your vision, but they need a return. That's probably still manageable. The third round, though, comes from people who need a return and they have board seats. And now, the government's accommodations kind of get started. And, each individual one is small. Each one is reasonable in isolation, but then they accumulate. And, 5 or 10 years later, you look at the cap table and board composition and the incentive structure, and the organization is nothing like what it was to start with. Not because anyone necessarily betrayed anything or intended to betray anything, but because the structure shifted underneath you. And that really happens one reasonable accommodation at a time. And every organization starts small, hopefully with good people. At least that's what I'd like to believe. But that's not the variable that matters in this. The variable that matters is what happens when the capital requirements grow. And you're right. I guess that does happen when things get significantly larger, in which case you could say that it's a problem of scale. But that's when the structure either holds or it doesn't. And, that's why I'm kind of trying to build this structure first before the capital pressure arrives, specifically because I don't think that, I don't think we would be immune to that pattern either. Nobody really is. And that was something that we thought about a lot up front.
Do you think it's like the challenge of scaling the values as the company grows? It's just not, you can't stick with the same values where it started. It's very hard to just keep the values, scale it with the company and the size of the company.
Sure, that's an issue, but I actually think that it's more driven by the capital structure.
Yeah. Okay, fair point. I mean, you mentioned regulatory barriers and pricing dynamics too. So how does the healthcare market actually function? And by the way, this is also, I read, the thing that you shared with me about healthcare is not a free market. It touches upon that a little bit too. So I'm really want to hear your thoughts here. How does the healthcare market actually functions?
Okay, so this, I really love Inigo Montoya's quote from The Princess Bride. You keep using that word. I do not think that word means what you think it means. In the healthcare industry, that word is, at least in the US, that's free market, right? So a real free market has two self-correcting mechanisms that keep it honest and keep it working. The first is low barriers to entry, meaning that if somebody is overcharging or underdelivering, a competitor can enter and offer to do something better. The second one is then consumer choice, meaning that the person paying for the good or service can evaluate the product or service and then take their money elsewhere if they want to. Healthcare has structurally removed both of these things. The barriers to entry are enormous. You've got FDA approval, clinical trials, manufacturing standards, distribution agreements, all sorts of junk. And, so those things aren't bad individually. Many of them exist for good reason, but the cumulative effect is that a small innovator with a better product can't enter the market and compete on merit. The regulatory cost alone, it creates a moat that has nothing to do with whether the product works or not. And then there's consumer choice that's essentially gone. The patient doesn't choose what drugs are available. The patient doesn't get to negotiate pricing. In many cases, the patient doesn't even know the price after the good or service. The person receiving the product and the person paying for the product are completely different people or different entities, separated by layers of insurance and so on and so forth. And that's not a free market at all. That's, this administration or administered system, with kind of these market aesthetics. And, this also isn't, it's not a conspiracy. This is really just economics here. And the extraction is an emergent property of a system where those self-correcting mechanisms have been removed. And when you remove accountability, you get exactly that, the behavior that economic theory predicts every single time.
Yeah. And so if, let's say, the intentions don't hold and the market mechanisms have been removed, what actually works then? Like what fills the what?
So this is where decentralized science can enter, or DeSci. And I'll be clear and start with, I'm not talking about crypto as a speculative vehicle. I'm talking about one specific property that blockchain-based governance provides. And that's, so you've got transparent, community verified decision making, where the people making the governance decisions bear the consequences of those decisions. So if you think about what this solves, look at the insulin problem, right? So that exists because people making the pricing decisions don't bear the cost of those decisions. And somebody just wanted to make as much money as they could. The patients end up bearing that cost. The decision makers capture the upside, and that's a structural misalignment. In a DAO, or a decentralized autonomous organization, governance token holders can vote on decisions like which IP bundles get released to whom, under what terms, and what price points. So I guess here's the key with all of this. If they make exploitative decisions, they're harming the ecosystem itself that their own tokens represent. Governance then extracts or the governance that extracts the value then degrades that platform, and the token holders feel that directly. That's the same self-correcting mechanism a free market is supposed to provide that in the healthcare industry doesn't really exist anymore. So you've got accountability through aligned incentives, not, we're promising to do the right thing and be good, and we've got the right people, or however you want to say that. The structure makes the mission aligned behavior the path of least resistance then, so that it's easier to do the right thing because the wrong thing hurts you directly. And there can be gray area between what's right and what's wrong. And, as long as you're comfortable with the decisions that you're making. But so actually here's something else that kind of goes beyond that constraint, and I think is really interesting. The governance community doesn't have to be limiting. It's also a massive distributed intelligence. So if you've got thousands of people that are tied into this with different backgrounds, different expertise and perspectives, all contributing to decisions that no single founder or board of directors could make those decisions as well as, this is the wisdom of crowds, right? So you've got patients who understand what access barriers look like in practice. You've got practitioners who know which indications matter the most. You've got scientists who can evaluate evidence quality. You've got different advocates who can understand underserved markets. And, so that's not a constraint on good decision making. That's kind of the best decision making infrastructure you could design. And that's what was missing from those cautionary tales, not to get better people, because any one person independently is going to want to do what's good for them. So you don't need necessarily these stronger commitments. You need a structure where accountability is built into the incentive architecture itself, where the quality of governance improves as the community grows.
Yeah. But the question begs here is now you are focusing a lot of effort in building this governance infrastructure,
Mm-hmm.
right? And already building company itself is humongous task in itself. Most founders spend that time building products, right? So why governance in your case? I guess give your personal anecdote of that. Why?
Yeah. So really the question is, why do this at all? Why not just go put all this together, sell it to pharma and be done? So as you know, my entire family got cancer a few years ago and both of my parents died. I've told you about kind of the vow that I made to do something about this. But so I guess I have to explain this a little bit. I was really angry about kind of the whole exploitation that we went through. We spent over, $100,000 on random crap that no one really thought would work. That was just for my dad. And I have a real problem with how the entire system works. So you pay into insurance for years when your risk is low and you don't cost much. And then, later in life, if you ever do get sick, the It feels like the last of your money gets extracted in the process of determining that you're untreatable. And then when you're all out of money to extract, the decision gets made that, oh, well, nothing else can be done. And that happens both on the conventional and the alternative sides. So it's not, again, this is more of a structural problem. And so sure, a chronic disease treatment is, I'm sure it's worth billions of dollars. Having it available would help lots of people, if we just sold it off to some pharma company who then developed it. And yeah, I guess that would benefit society. But if I let it be developed like everything else, it will be used in the kind of the same extractive way that everything else is used. It'll just feed into the same system as everything else. And I kind of would have satisfied maybe the letter of my vow, but not really the spirit. And, again, I'm human too here. And I know that under enough financial pressure with enough board members telling me, to make these accommodations and, enough zeros on an acquisition offer, there's a version of me that might rationalize breaking that promise as well. And that might not happen today, not with everything as fresh, I suppose, but, in another 10 years or 15, and after years of this kind of, the regulatory grind and fundraising exhaustion, I can't guarantee what future me would do under that kind of pressure. And I don't think anyone really can. So I'm trying to build a structure that doesn't depend on me staying strong with, willpower and such, and believing that this is the right thing to do. The governance that we're trying to set up exists because the problem, I guess I'll say the promise is too important to kind of leave to willpower. And if I ever become the problem myself, I want that the architecture can be able to route around me as well.
Yeah. I know it personally. Was the reason we felt mission aligned to even work together, especially on this podcast. So I guess walk us through how you have structured the governance, like who owns what, who decides what, and why does the decision matters.
Sure. So now in reference directly back to the eyeball technology, so the IP already exists at this point. It's patented with allowed claims. I don't know if we said that before. But from there, we have kind of three distinct roles, and the separation kind of between them is the whole point here. The first is the Ionic Alliance Foundation and the IAF DAO. That would be the governance layer. So the foundation and its DAO are where the mission alignment gets enforced. They decide which IP bundles get released, to whom, under what terms. They enforce kind of the lane discipline, which I guess we'll probably have to talk about. They verify milestones. And so this is really where the community gets its voice. The second layer is the Ionic Alliance Group, or IAG. And that's kind of the platform operator. IAG maintains kind of manufacturing standards and the quality systems and formulation stability, different testing protocols, all that kind of stuff. Think of IAG as kind of the backbone that ensures every downstream product meets the same technical standards, regardless of who's commercializing it. And then third are I guess I call them the program companies. And those are the execution entities. So each program co gets a bounded license. That's what I'm calling that IP bundle for specific delivery method, indication set, and geography. They then get to commercialize that. They capture the revenue, execute kind of within their lane, and then pay licenses back to everybody else. And then so the separation between all of these is important because no single entity governs or both governs the IP and then profits from its use. So the program codes can commercialize kind of all on their own, right? Once they get an IP bundle, they can go down whatever path they want to. And if they want to be extractive, well, perhaps they can do that, but then they're going to run into some issues because they're many other program codes that might not be doing that. And there will be competition between them. So now we can have something closer to a free market. And the IF DAO is controlling what to put into those bundles in the first place and what to add to them later on. So if you are being extractive and the community doesn't like it, they might not authorize giving you new IP bundles to continue down adding different types of products that are similar to what you already have. So this is kind of it's all built in to get the incentives to align correctly. But I guess I'll connect back to what I said a moment ago. Even if I own personally every entity in this stack, the architecture still drives the mission aligned behavior. And that choke point is structural, not personal. And then the system is designed to work even, if I'm having a bad day or a bad decade. And that's kind of the point here, that I wouldn't be able to release IP directly to something that is misaligned with what the community wants it to be doing.
You mentioned structural choke point. So can you explain that? What makes that single decision so important?
Sure. So, because on any platform, there's basically one decision that has more leverage than every other decision combined, most often. And for eyeball, that decision really is what IP gets released, to whom and under what conditions. So if you think about it, if you govern that decision well, everything downstream almost takes care of itself, right? A program co can get a well-bounded license with clear obligations and milestone requirements, and they're going to operate within the bounds because that's the deal. Their license depends on it. But if you govern that decision poorly, and you give somebody either too broad a license, or you don't include the evidence return requirements, or you let them lock up adjacent indications that they're never going to develop, then nothing you do downstream can really fix that. No amount of operational excellence compensates for bad IP release decisions. And that's really kind of the exact lesson that we should have learned with the insulin there, right? The IP was released without governance mechanisms, specifically that could survive the economic pressure over time. And I think it's clear what their original intent was, but the structure didn't enforce that. And by the time the structural capture was visible, it was too late. People were dying. Government regulation had to step in, which, by the way, I believe is a very poor mechanism for ensuring efficiency or cost effectiveness for anything. The governments, they like to do this stuff, but they're not good at it. And so trying to build an entire architecture around that one decision, every other design kind of choice is downstream of it. And the DAO's primary function is governing that IP release, not fundraising, not community building. Those might happen as natural consequences, but they're secondary. Is the choke point, because that's where mission alignment either holds or breaks. And this is where the eyeball governance token, that would be the little $sign, IBAL. Hopefully that's our symbol. So when you hold the eyeball token, you're not buying a lottery ticket. You're buying a seat at the table where the highest leverage decisions on the platform get made. And to borrow a phrase from Uncle Ben, that's real power, which comes with real responsibility. And the quality of those decisions then determine whether the platform serves its mission or drifts. And every token holder is now a steward of that chokehold, or that choke point.
Yeah. One thing you mentioned that stood out is the evidence return requirement. And you said, like every licensee, I guess those are program codes must contribute data to the platform. Why is that non-negotiable, I guess?
Because the evidence compounds, right? So think about it from the perspective of the fifth program co to launch, right? So the fourth program co has been generating data. Well, actually, the first through the fourth have all been generating data and returning it in these, standardized forms. The fifth program co then inherits kind of this evidence base that no single company could have built on its own, at least not without that, the capital structure being the most important part, which would then destroy everything that we're trying to do. So you've got wound care data can inform dermatology pathways, and antimicrobial data can support the European regulatory submissions, and biofilm elimination data supports periodontal applications. Each program code data makes every other program code's position stronger, and it only works if the evidence return there is non-negotiable. If it's optional, the program codes with the most commercially valuable and viable data have the least incentive to share it. And you get kind of exactly the wrong outcome there. The most valuable evidence then stays siloed, and the platform then fragments, and the structural capital requirements step in to control things, because now you need more capital in every single program code to do what you need to do. So it is or will be a condition of the license. You don't get the IP without that evidence return commitment. And so at that point, the cost of sharing is low, but the compounding value really is enormous. And it requires governance there to enforce, because individual incentives would probably pull in the opposite direction.
Yeah. And you also said something called lane discipline. And I guess what is that, and what happens when someone, I guess, crosses a lane?
Okay, so that's a slightly different thing. Lane discipline is really the rule that keeps kind of, I would separate them into four distinct messaging contexts. You've got education, consumer, commercialization, research, and then regulated claims. And, the fastest way to destroy a platform like this would be for, to let the lanes bleed together. If a consumer product borrows disease claims from a regulated device submission, for example, then you've got a big regulatory problem. And if the research outputs get repurposed as marketing copy, then you've compromised the research integrity. And so none of them can really borrow from others except with strict control. And you can get one enthusiastic marketer who says that, it's clinically proven to heal wounds on a consumer product label. And then suddenly the regulatory teams, the 2-year FDA submission strategy gets compromised. That's not where we want to be, for sure. So lane discipline is a license obligation. Violations will have defined consequences, and enforcement kind of belongs, again, back to that governance layer, not the program codes themselves. The enforcement belongs to the governance layer, not the program codes, because the program codes themselves, they're going to have competing interests, right? But the governance layer incentive is actually platform integrity.
Makes sense. Okay. And what does this governance layer actually make possible? What does the broader platform look like?
So the architecture that we've described here kind of enables multiple eyeball development branches or entities to operate simultaneously without interfering with each other. And actually, in that case, the sum is greater than the parts. And that's where the platform starts to look like something much larger than just a single product, right? The consumer nutritional products, which could be skin health and nasal and ocular and oral, they don't require FDA clearance because they're positioned differently. They're wellness products. Lower regulatory burden, faster to market, but I guess they are still, absolutely, they're still built on the same platform standards and formulation backbone. You've got, I guess, cosmetic ingredient licensing. That would be like a B2B, where we would license the formulation technology to other cosmetic manufacturers who want to incorporate Eyeball's ionic cofactor approach into their product lines. So that's a completely different business model, but the same IP, same governance is applied. An interesting thing there would also be to use Eyeball as a preservative ingredient rather than have to put in, these other weird preservatives that are always, none of those things are any good for you. But that would also be within that B2B lane there. But then you come into the more advanced delivery methods, and these would be regulatory claims for aerosolized, for respiratory applications, ocular, oral again, even injectable at this point. And each of those have their own regulatory pathway. They require their own evidence and then would be in their own program code. But lots of the data cross, and data from one can support data in another, and so on and so forth. And that's the insight there, is that each branch strengthens every other branch. And wound care data informs dermatology. Antimicrobial evidence supports the nasal and oral applications. And consumer product feedback actually can identify which indications to even go after. Identify, well, I don't want to say identify adverse event signals, but hopefully it identifies the absence of them. And then that can help support the regulated or regulatory submissions. And again, as all of this evidence compounds across the entire platform, and each individual branch is its own separate IP bundle that gets separately funded, separately governed as an entity itself, not getting the IP in the first place. That's still the IFDAO, and having separate execution. So each one of these is, a little fundable company in and of itself that doesn't have a huge burden over the top of it. It's got an IP bundle. It knows exactly what it can do. It knows exactly what its responsibilities are, and it can run from there. And so that's communities making the calls on what IP to release. But then once it gets into a company, we're not bogging down that company with, okay, well, now this company can't make decisions on its own without going back and getting input from everyone else in the world, or every other eyeball token holder, unless they want it. And that's really what this kind of eyeball token governance looks like at scale.
And how would those indications actually come about? I guess, is there a formal R&D pipeline, or does that platform generate them differently? How would that work?
So, there can be a formal R&D pipeline, but that's also controlled by the DAO and all of that input that we talked about earlier. So I've actually got a really perfect example because it happened last week. I was listening to Vita DAO funded presentation on periodontal disease, and it was about something else, a little bit about something else. But in that presentation, I learned that researchers found that NSAIDs like Advil and or Tylenol, I guess, control gut inflammation fairly well. And that ended up improving things within periodontal disease. But they found that the effect only lasted as long as you kept taking their drugs. And the moment you stopped, it came right back. And thought that was a little funny because if you understand microimmune dynamics, well, then that's completely predictable because they never addressed the causal terrain, right? The NSAIDs are suppressing the inflammatory signal, but the biofilm's still there, and biofilms are notoriously difficult to deal with once they're established. And their presence is actually what drives the inflammatory reactions, and that's exacerbating the disease in the first place, and so on and so forth. So the biofilms, they're still there, right? And they're exacerbating the disease, but the cofactors are missing, and you end up pausing the problem, not fixing it. Regardless, let me move on. So I'm sitting here thinking, we have a formulation that addresses biofilm through the oligodynamic effect and delivers ionic cofactors that allow the terrain itself to reset the inflammatory signaling. And the delivery method in this instance is pretty obvious. It'd be a mouthwash. And that's, so you've got direct mucosal contact and a daily use habit of mouthwash that's already established. So then it would fit perfectly. So, within an hour of hearing somebody else's research funded by the same DeSci ecosystem that I want to be a part of, and I had, a plausible new indication, a natural delivery format, and even the mechanistic rationale as to why that should exist. I even contacted the presenter later and submitted it, and he said that, yeah, we need to talk. I didn't plan on that. And, the platform in that sense kind of generated that. And that's what happens when you're connected to broad research community instead of sitting in a little pharma silo staring at your own pipeline. The governance piece there, right? So I guess that mouthwash application would be a completely separate IP bundle, but you'd have the same DAO process behind it that would release it. And then, the community evaluates the evidence and the opportunity and the pathway, and they decide whether to fund it or not. Not, me sitting in a room deciding what's next. Now, for sure, I might understand the technology better than most people, at least for now, in which case, probably early on, what I have to say has a lot of merit, but at some point, other people are going to understand this, and they're probably going to understand things better than I do at some point, and they're going to have all sorts of experience that I don't have, and all sorts of knowledge that I don't have about specific indications, and so on and so forth. And all of that, I would never be able to get all of that information myself, so I wouldn't be able to make as good decisions as the wisdom of crowds.
Yeah. And I guess what happens to the DAO itself over time as more of these execution entities come online?
Sure. And I guess that's a natural question because, we could set this up all perfect now, but things change. So I would plan that it would evolve through at least 3 stages. And, the community's role actually becomes more substantive at each phase because then there's more to govern, right? So the first phase is kind of where we are now, which is kind of project governance. The community would be verifying milestones for specific projects. Did those deliverables get completed? Did the results justify, or do the results justify the next phase of operations? And all of that can be very binary verification of tasks. It's important for sure, but it's also relatively straightforward. So that would be easy stuff to get done. And at this point, the community is learning to govern together and kind of building that muscle, if you will. Then phase 2 would be the IP release governance. And this is where it starts to get much more interesting. This is what we were talking about mostly. And as the platform matures, the DAO starts making those highest leverage decisions, which IP bundles get released, which licensees qualify, what terms in the license would protect the mission, and how to sequence indications, and so on and so forth. Those are the substantive strategic decisions that shape the platform's direction. And that's where the network effect of the governance community then starts to really shine. And again, right. So I touched on this a little bit. You've got patients saying, this indication is underserved and matters enormously. You've got scientists saying the evidence base is strong enough to support this pathway. You've got business-minded folks saying the market dynamics work for this bundle. And there's no board of directors, no matter how talented they are, can match that breadth of perspective. And in that case, the community gets smarter as it grows. So that was phase 2. Phase 3 is now you get into more ecosystem governance where you've got multiple program codes or those execution entities that are generating revenue, contributing evidence back, operating across multiple different markets. And the decisions there become how do royalties get allocated, which research programs then get funded. How do we subsidize access to underserved markets? How do we balance the commercial viability and the mission alignment? And so really at every phase here, the eyeball token is the mechanism. And it's not a financial instrument that happens to have governance attached. It's a governance instrument that happens to have financial implications. And that distinction really matters. When you hold the eyeball token, you're accepting the responsibility for the platform's direction. The power to shape the IP release decisions and verify milestones and allocate resources and such. That's not a passive investment. That's really active stewardship. And the token can evolve too, right? It starts as a purely governance token, purely utility. And as the economics mature and there are real revenue flows that then need to be governed, the community might decide that it makes sense to register it or either register it as or set up a secondary token to be a security. And that decision, again, should belong to the community to use, not to whatever founders or that's something that I want the community to be able to step in and make decisions for, right? And then the governance infrastructure really exists specifically so that those kinds of structural decisions can be made collectively, transparency, and with as much full information as possible.
Now let's talk about money. So how does value actually flow in the system and who benefits?
Yeah, so I guess I'd like to be a little bit more direct with this because I think that the DeSci community kind of deserves clarity on their economics. So in our case, the program codes or the execution entities would pay license fees and royalties. That flows back into the platform. those flows are then governed by the DAO. It's not predetermined where that money goes. It's governed by the community based on the actual performance and evolving priorities. So what I'm laying out is a description of the structure, not a guarantee of returns. And whether a platform generates returns depends on execution and regulatory outcomes and market adoption and 100 other variables that we can't guarantee. But what we can guarantee is that whatever value the platform creates gets governed by the community, not captured by insiders. Now, again, the execution entity, well, they're operating on their own. They get to keep all of their profits, but all of the license fees and all the royalties and everything that comes back, that's what then goes into the platform. And that's where the platform gets to choose. Otherwise, the entity itself would never be able to raise money. If you can't raise money saying somebody else that's not associated with us is going to make all the decisions as to where our profit goes. Well, that obviously you wouldn't invest in that company. But so again, you've got the compounding effects of all of this create real value. You've got the evidence compounding means that each subsequent program or each one of their regulatory pathways is cheaper and faster because the data generated by earlier ones is available. You've got manufacturing scales across all of them because they share the platform's kind of production backbone, or they can. You've got quality systems built by one and once can then serve all of them. You've got, if we go directly into the money of the tokens, new tokens would only be able to be minted through a DAO vote, and then they would only be tied to new IP bundle releases, not kind of this arbitrary inflation. And you wouldn't be able to dilute the community through unilateral minting. Every new token then represents a new governed asset. And it's a fundamentally different economic model than most token projects, where supply expansion or contraction is discretionary or pre-programmed. And then their whole intent is to manipulate the supply and demand to increase the value, right? That sounds like a security to me. That's not what we're trying to do at all. The architecture really ensures that value that does come in through licensing and royalties and such can't bypass the governance layer. And every dollar of royalty revenue, every piece of evidence and new IP release flows through that governed system. So there's no side door there and no loops back to what I said earlier about myself. Even if I wanted to route around the governance, the architecture doesn't allow it. And future me can't circumvent what present me builds. And that's really the whole point. And honestly, in an industry where the default is this opaque pricing, buried IP, and insider capture and transparent community governance, it really shouldn't feel radical, but it absolutely does, because it doesn't exist. That really tells you something about this industry, the healthcare or health industry.
Yeah. And is this architecture specific to what you are building, or does it have wider applications for anyone?
Yeah, it does. It does have wider applications. We should also maybe clarify, I'm not necessarily building all of this, right? Most of this is layering on top of what decentralized science has already put together. But does it have to stay in science? Perhaps not, right? I think that every technology with broad application potential faces the same structural challenge that we described in the earlier in the conversation, the tension between kind of this public benefit and commercial viability, the pressure for structural capture as capital requirements grow, the inadequacy of good intentions as a governance mechanism, for sure. That's not unique to healthcare. Agricultural technology faces it, clean energy faces it, education faces it. Anywhere you have a platform that could serve public good and requires significant capital to develop and is expected to get large enough, you have the same structural dynamics and the same kind of incremental accommodations that eventually end up capturing it. And I'm not claiming to have solved this for everyone and or every domain, but I believe that what we've designed here is an architecture that addresses that structural capital capture problem. That's a mouthful. I'm hopefully about to run a concrete test with kind of a binary outcome. right? So with all of this, the architecture is open and the governance model is transparent. We just laid it all out for you. If somebody in agricultural biotech wants to look at what we built and or what we end up building and says, that role separation and IP release choke point model would work great for our platform, then, great. Go ahead and adapt it and approve it. And, my goal was never this kind of proprietary governance advantage. The goal here is to demonstrate that mission aligned innovation can be structurally durable, not through better people or stronger personal commitments and such, and company programs to, for values or all of this kind of weird stuff that doesn't really work, but actually through an architecture that makes the right thing easier to do than the wrong thing. And that's at least what I feel is that's what I owe my parents, not a product by itself, which would be amazing all by itself. But what I really want is a model that works and then prove that it can work.
And one clarifying question too, you mentioned about that concrete test. What is that you are planning to do?
Yeah, so that is, we're pursuing a FDA 510K clearance for Ion Gel ZCM25, funded entirely through DeSci. So that would be community funded with milestone gating. And the outcome of that is binary. The FDA either clears it or they don't. And there's no ambiguity with, how well did you do? The clearance letter is a public document. And what makes this really interesting beyond our own product there is, and thinking about this, is that the risk profile is fundamentally different than anything else that DeSci is currently funded or funded before or currently funding. So we know that the product already works. It already has regulatory approvals in Mexico and the UAE. It's been on the market. The remaining risk here really is procedural, not scientific. And the funding model itself is the governance architecture operating in real time. So this might have been difficult to do with decentralized science on a brand new thing. But again, they're normally starting really, really early because that's when the researchers need the money. We've already done that. We've already got the IP. We've got approved patent claims, and it can be very large as a platform for sure. And we want to make sure that it is governed correctly. But I think that our next podcast episode is going to focus on this a little bit. And then we can kind of walk through exactly how and why I think the 510K approval works to validate decentralized science or validate that decentralized science can do really meaningful things and not just fund science for the sake of science. And we could be the first proof point that DeSci can fund regulatory outcomes and not only that early stage research. And at least I intend for Eyeball to be the project that proves that this works, or the Ion Gel.
Yeah, that's the plan here, right? So and this is for all our listeners too. Again, if you are interested in any which way, to be honest, to even spread the word or to involve in helping and being part of this thing, as we are covering here, we will be doing the updates. You can be on the wait list too. Just reach out to us. We'll keep you when things go live, all that stuff. We can keep you in the loop. But you know how to find us. You can reach out on show's website. You can message from there, or you can reach out on LinkedIn directly to Jason or to even me, and we'll find a way to engage you and keep you posted how things are progressing. And yeah, this is the end of today's conversation. We will be back again with the next episode, going into deeper, as Jason said. We'll covering the next steps into this, how these things work in more details. And appreciate your time, Jason. Thanks again for sharing all the insights.
All right, thank you.
All right, we'll see you next time.